Hello everyone! The Grenke Chess Classic continued after one break day and it moved to Baden from Karlsruhe. And in today's round 4 there were unfortunately 4 draws and only one decisive result. Magnus drew his game and so did Levan Aronian and Ruy Fan and the rest of them. And in this game, Fabiano Caruana faced Arkadij Naiditch, who is currently an Azerbaijani player, but he used to play for Germany and for Latvia as well. He's rated about 2700, a bit above that. And Fabiano is now with the new rating list from April. He is rated 2804, so he crossed the 28 mark. And in this game, he had the white pieces. He opened with pawn to e4. Arkadij Naiditch responds with e5, knight to f3, knight c6, and bishop to b5. Caruana goes for the Ruy Lopez or the Spanish game. And perhaps unfortunately for the spectators, Naiditch decides to go for the Berlin defense. He plays knight to f6. And now Caruana didn't enter the so-called Berlin endgame, which would go with castles by white, knight takes e4, d4, knight d6, bishop takes, d takes e5, knight a5, and the queen exchange, so the famous Berlin endgame. But he chose a bit rarer line, which is the second most common move. He played d3. And this now enters a very positional game and a very maneuvering game in which both sides stand a chance, and the plans are a bit different than in the closed Ruy Lopez lines, such as the Chigorin or the Breyer, because there is no a5, a6 or b5 played and the bishop is still on b5. So the position is a bit different and white has to decide what to do with the bishop, and very often the position will resemble an Italian more than a Spanish game. Now Arkadij Naiditch plays d6. This is the most common move. Defending e5, which was now attacked, and white was actually threatening to take the c6 knight and then take the e5 pawn, now that he played d3 and defended his e4 pawn. So d6 is the logical reply, white castles, and this is all the main line. This has been played over 2000 times. Bishop to d7, rook to e1, bishop to e7, c3, and instead of castling on move 5, white could have played c3 here and the position would transpose. This is just the most common and the most logical way for both sides to develop. Black doesn't really have any squares for his bishops apart from e7 and d7. White has to capture the long e-file and activate the rook, and he's also making an escape square for the bishop with c3 and preparing to push d4. Thus he played c3, which is a very useful move in this position and in actually most Spanish lines. Castles now by Naiditch, h3. This move is also very common and very important because it's preventing the bishop from pinning the knight on g4 now that the diagonal is open, and he's also in some positions threatening to play knight to g4. So now h3 is preventing all of that. Rook to e8, a4. This is a common idea and very aggressive, but the point of a4 is to grab the initiative on the queen side and to grab some space before black has a chance to do that. And in this exact position, this has only been played once, but in similar positions, it's a very common idea. Now bishop to f8. This now resembles the Breyer setup for black, in which he might go for g6, bishop to g7 and developing the bishop that way because it really wasn't useful on e7. Bishop to g5 now, and black didn't play h6 exactly because of that plan, because he might play g6 and then after that bishop to g7, so h6 would be too much of a weakness and it would actually fall pretty easily because white usually plays queen to d2 and attacks h6 anyway. He plays h6 now, forcing the bishop away, but I think it's a bit of a weakening move and now white actually stands a little bit better. He should have kept the tension in this position and the bishop wasn't actually threatening that much. Bishop goes to h4, of course not relieving the pin, and g5. Arkadij played h6 for a reason, and without g5 it would have been weakening, but now he has compensation for that and he's grabbing space on the king side, but it's a double-edged move as well because he's weakening his king a lot, and in some positions you can imagine the queen coming to d2 and then the knight sacrificing itself on g5 or the bishop sacrificing itself, and white would have at least a perpetual check or a forced draw. But g5 is okay and it's double-edged, but white doesn't stand that much better. Bishop to g3, of course saving the bishop. Knight to e7. offering a trade of bishops and controlling the very important f5 square once more. Bishop takes d7, queen takes, knight b to d2, knight to g6, and this knight is now perfectly placed, and it's controlling key squares and threatening to enter f4, which is the best square for the knight in the Spanish games, and vice versa. White would love to get his knight to f5, but in this case the bishop is already on g3, so it's controlling the important f4 square, I'm sorry. Knight to c4 by Caruana, rook a to d8. This move isn't really that useful, but in some positions black would aim to push with d5 and to open up the position, but I think it's too early now, and it would only weaken black. But it's a case of the threat being stronger than the execution, because now white will always have to look out for d5 once it's strengthened with rook to d8. The knight goes to e3, that was the point of the move, and now it's looking at the f5 square, and this is now getting a bit dangerous for black, and white now has a slight edge, because if the knight manages to get to f5, then it would target the weak h6 pawn. It would force black to look out for tactics. On the e7 square, it would attack the d6 pawn, which means that c5 is never an option, etc, etc. So knight to f5 would be the biggest threat at the moment for both sides. And Arkadij immediately decides to react, not aggressively, not prematurely, but he's just looking for his own activity, and he's looking for compensation in the position. He strikes with d5. And it wasn't the best move in the position, but it's very much justified, because from a human's perspective, you are looking for some counterplay, and he shouldn't play passively, because Caruana is so strong that he would punish that in a few moves. Caruana reacts with d takes d5. Taking with the knight would be a bad move, because the knight wouldn't control f5 anymore. Bishop to g7, developing the bishop on the long diagonal, and even though it's blocked at the moment, the bishop could become very useful if Caruana isn't careful. And now d4 by Caruana. This is a very good move, because it's resolving the central tension, but in a very favorable way for white, and whether black takes or doesn't, white will have a much stronger center, and I think it's better to take, and Arkadij did, because if he allows d takes c, then white's position would be stronger, and the d5 pawn would be defended by the knight and by the queen, so black couldn't capture it anymore. So e takes d4, and now c takes d4. And in this position, Arkadij grabs the pawn, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, and rook takes c1 check. And after queen takes c1, of course recapturing the piece, queen takes d5, and this position is now pretty much equal. White lost his opening advantage, because his d-pawn is now weak and isolated, and it's actually easily rounded up in this position, and I think Caruana went a bit wrong with capturing with the c-pawn. In this position, after e takes d, he should have played something else, like queen takes d4. This would have been favorable, because after knight takes d5, queen takes d5, queen takes, knight takes. If you notice, the pawns they aren't isolated in this case, and the b pawn is much more easily defended now, and the bishop can't just attack it simply. So this would have been favorable for Caruana, and much better than the position that occurred in the game, because after rook takes e1, queen takes d5. And now, I'm sorry, queen takes d5. In this position, Caruana has to regain his pawn first of all, because Arkadij was threatening to get a pawn up, to go a pawn up. So bishop takes c7, and now rook to c8, attacking the bishop. And now Caruana stands equal, and his position is actually much harder to play than black's, because he lost his initiative and he gave black too much activity for his pieces. Black's bishop, Arkadij's bishop on g7 is an absolute beast, and this piece is controlling half the board, and when compared with this bishop that has to run away, it's much more active. The knight is great on g6, and the queen is much more active on d5 than white's queen, and the rook as well. So Caruana temporarily went a pawn up, but I think his position is a bit worse. In this position, of course, after rook to c8, he has to defend the bishop, so rook to c1, and now Arkadij gets his pawn back, bishop takes, and now queen to d2, which I'm not sure was the best move. I think he should have taken the bishop right away with the knight and just exchanged the pieces, but queen to d2 is pinning the bishop to the queen, so he will grab it afterwards. Queen to d7, attacking Caruana's bishop in exchange. Knight takes d4, now rook takes c7, rook takes c7, queen takes c7, and knight to f5. And now, after all the exchanges, Caruana managed to dissolve his weak central pawn, and this is where Arkadij, I think, went wrong. He shouldn't have changed his c7 pawn, which was strong and connected to his queenside pawn island, for the weak d4 pawn, because now White managed to get rid of his only weakness in the position, and now, okay, now it's perfectly equal, and this is a perfect drawing position, and neither side really has a chance unless the other side blunders. There is supercomputers would draw this 100 times out of 100 games, and there is two major factors. First, the symmetrical pawn structure, both on the queen side and on the king side, which means that there is little to no chance of creating a passed pawn for either side. And secondly, the fact that both sides only have a queen and the knight, which, okay, they can coordinate very well and create a mating attack, but not when there is a queen and a knight defending. So this is now a drawing position. But now at this moment, Caruana's skill level comes into play, and the fact that he is 100 points rated than Naiditch, and that he is 2800, and that he's probably, if not the best player in the world at the moment, perhaps even better than Magnus, but we will see that in a few months. So now Arkadij continues with king to h7, attacking his king away, which I don't think was a good move, because he's going away from the defense of f7, but it's preventing some checks by White. And after king to h7, g3, solidifying his position, knight to e5, centralizing, queen e3, knight to c4, attacking both the queen and the b2 pawn, queen to c3, defending, and also threatening, of course, mate in 1. So Arkadij has to defend. Queen to e5. He's offering a trade of queens and going for a draw because, of course, he has the black pieces and he would like to have a draw in this position. But from the first 3 rounds of the Grenke Classic, he only has 1 point, so I don't really support his drawing offer. And Caruana had 2 points after 3 rounds with 2 draws and 1 win, so he had an okay score. He would have had 50% if they drew this game. A bit more than 50%, sorry. Queen to d3 now, of course declining the trade, and what's more important, threatening a nasty discover check to the king. And now knight takes b2, which I'm not sure is the best move. Of course, now if Caruana moves his knight anywhere, then this wouldn't be a dangerous check because Naiditch could just capture the queen. So queen to c2, attacking the knight and still threatening the check. Queen to e1 check, king to g2, queen to d1, once again offering the trade of queens. And now queen to e4, remaining, keeping that threat alive, and I think the threat would be fatal if Naiditch doesn't stop that. And now he plays a major mistake in the position, queen takes a4. And of course this move is still keeping an eye on the queen, and if Caruana moves the knight somewhere, let's say knight to e7 check, then just queen takes queen and black is winning. But if Caruana manages to find the double check, then he would win the position instantly. And now, after queen takes a4, he takes on b7, and this is why queen takes a4 was a mistake. It was controlling the queen, but it let go of the b7 pawn, along with letting Caruana target the f7 pawn, which is now becoming really hard to defend. And you can imagine if he takes the f7 pawn, then the king is just a few moves away from being checkmated. And now queen to a2, which is defending f7, but now knight to e3. And this was the killer move, and in this position Caruana has a completely winning advantage despite being a pawn down, and it might look equal now because Arkadij is holding up and defending f7, but this move knight to e3 is so strong because of one simple reason. There is no good squares for the black knight. It can't go to d1, it can't go to c4, and it can't get into the game. So Arkadij is now playing a piece down virtually, and the queen has to keep guard of the f7 pawn, and now his pieces are completely immobile, and White is just waiting for a chance to crash through and to checkmate. He plays king to g7, now, which is defending f7 and relieving some of the pressure and making the queen able to move. But after queen to b4, which is now threatening a nasty check here from d4, he plays queen to b1, which I'm not sure what the purpose of this move was, but the move is absurd and is just giving Caruana a free hand in the attack. He plays g4 first of all, which is a good move, and it gives the knight a strong outpost on f5, which the queen was now defending, so now any knight f5 checks would be possible. And now king to g8, getting away from the check, which still he could have done it after knight to f5. Knight to f5 anyway, queen to c2, queen to b8 check, king to h7, queen to b7 attacking f7 once again, and now king to h8, which this is a nothing move. It does absolutely nothing. And now, of course, Caruana can take on f7. He can do whatever he likes. This position, if you ask the engines, it's, I think, more than plus 50, despite he is a pawn down. And there is just no way for white to defend checkmate anymore. And he continues with, Caruana continues with queen to e7, threatening queen to f6 check and queen to g7 mate next move. And this is where Arkadij Naiditch actually resigned. And okay, if he tried to defend, what could he do? I'm not sure what he could have done. If he tries something like queen to c6 check, let's say, trying to prolong the suffering, then just king to g1, and that's it. What do you do now? There's just nothing you can do. He can try queen to g6 defending, but queen to e5 check, king to h7, and queen takes b2, just grabbing the knight, and the black king will be checkmated in a few moves anyway. And the queen has to stay guard here of the g7 square, because the position is otherwise completely lost. So I think this game shows how strong Fabiano Caruana really is, and I think most players of their strength would agree to a draw in that position with a symmetrical pawn structure both on the queen side and on the king side, and queen versus knight. But he fought on, and he lured Naiditch into taking a pawn and going a pawn up, which gave him enough chance and enough time to create an attack. And the queen and the knight are able to coordinate very well if they're given enough time. And since Arkadij Naiditch wasted his to grab a pawn, Caruana was able to create a mating threat, and he succeeded, and he managed to win a very nice game. Okay, everybody, thanks very much for watching. And I hope you like this Berlin defense, which turned out not to be so boring as its reputation. And stay tuned for more chess from the Grenke Chess Classic. Thanks very much. Cheers. Bye.